It's Thursday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. Joining me, Conservative MP David Johnston, Green Party MP Caroline Lucas, Guardian columnist Sonia Sodha and Times sketch writer and author Quentin Letts. Today, should we worry about vaccine delays?
We are experiencing some supply issues, so it does mean that the vaccine rollout will be slightly slower than we might have hoped.
Will sending asylum seekers abroad deter migrants? We'll look at the replacement for the EU's Erasmus scheme for students.
Why is this Tory government taking opportunities away from our young people?
The Turing project is designed to help kids across the country of all income groups.
And this was a park in Liverpool yesterday. Is COVID compliance faltering? Right, Sonia, Australia does have a scheme, a little bit like the one that has been reported on, so it does actually happen.
It does happen, but that scheme has been incredibly criticised, including by the UN. There are lots of people that say that it isn't compliant with international law, as well as Australia's obligations, moral obligations to asylum seekers. And the Australian system has been plagued by terrible, terrible reports of human rights abuses. And I think that's the question for the government today. Asylum seekers, they are fleeing conflict, war-torn regions. They have a right to claim asylum when they reach a country, and to deport them to a country where there aren't good safeguards for their human rights would potentially be in conflict with human rights law. I think the other thing we really need to do is to put this in context, because I think this is the government sort of picking a culture war, almost using asylum seekers as pawns in it. And if you were to listen to the government, you would think we've got huge problems with, massive increases in the number of asylum claims. That's just not happening. In fact, asylum claims have gone down in the last year. They're about half the level they were in the early 2000s. We have way, way fewer applications in countries like France and Germany. Our rate of application per citizen compared to the EU average is
Sonia,
much lower.
what's your take on this row, really, between the EU and the UK?
Well, I think it's a massively unhelpful ratcheting up by Ursula von der Leyen. It really helps no one to sort of be issuing these threats across the English Channel. But I would agree with Caroline, actually, that I think we need to take a step back, because when we're having these sort of rows between ourselves as a sort of set of richer countries that have much better access to vaccines, we tend to sort of forget the fact that there are countries with no access at all. And I would say absolutely it's a matter of solidarity. We should, obviously we care about vaccinating our own population desperately, but we should also be thinking about equitable access for countries who are less rich than ourselves. But also there's some real self-interest here as well, which is that I think over the next 2 or 3 years, the risk that scientists are worried about is that we start to see variants develop that might be vaccine resistant. And the way to sort of ward against that globally is to make sure that there is as equitable a distribution of vaccines as possible to avoid new variants of COVID springing up that could actually, in 2 years, pose a massive challenge to us again that may be perhaps more difficult to develop vaccines from scratch.
Sonia, there may be some self-interest. Is that not natural for individual governments, whatever you have said, and Caroline too?
I think it's natural for governments to be short-termist about this. And I think, we've seen our own government be very short-termist, not necessarily about vaccines and vaccines rollout, but in terms of, the way it's approached, for example, the timing of lockdowns, it tends to leave it too late to impose them. And then that leads to much higher costs later down the line because of the nature of a virus that sort of spreads exponentially. So absolutely, it is the case that politicians tend to take too short-termist a view, even when it comes to our country's self-interest. But this is such, this is sort of the biggest kind of global threat that we've faced in terms of health terms for a very long time. So you've kind of got to hope that maybe it is a bit idealistic, but I think it's really important to put pressure on politicians to think about this from the long term.
I've never heard of Erasmus before.
Right.
About 2 years ago. I'm all in favour of international exchanges. I went off as a 17-year-old to Kentucky for a year with an English-speaking union scholarship. The English-speaking union has lots of those sort of schemes still running, so I'd encourage youngsters to, if they feel up for that sort of thing, really to apply for these things. But I think there's a lot of sort of continuity politics going on in this discussion.
Right, Sonia, do you agree about that? Is it just about Brexit?
No, I think there are very real concerns when you look at the detail of the Turing scheme and how it's going to work, about whether it is going to actually provide these opportunities for young people. And the reason I say that is, David's right that it provides slightly more, not lots more, in terms of living costs for British students who go abroad to study. But under Erasmus, there is an arrangement that when a student goes abroad, their tuition fees at that institution abroad are waived as part of the scheme. Now, Turing requires UK universities to sort of strike bilateral deals with European universities and universities elsewhere. And I think there's a danger because of the increased costs of coming to study in the UK as a result of Brexit. It's expensive, you've got to pay for visa, the NHS charge, etc., that actually we see a reduction in places, which I think, quite apart from the maintenance issue, would be really, really troubling because of the exchange of ideas that comes through these schemes.
Receive that reciprocity. The fundamental thing for me, though, is that if it's a taxpayer-funded scheme, we need to see more disadvantaged young people getting their first experience of being abroad, rather than just the wealthiest getting their latest experience of being abroad.
Right, and Caroline,
can I just
jump
in there? Because absolutely no one would disagree with that, but there's so much that could have been done within the scope of Erasmus on that. And I do think absolutely there should be more support for disadvantaged students, but we've really got to look at this government's policy over the last 10 years. They've not been putting their money where their mouth is. When you look at the conversion of maintenance grants to loans, for example, loading more debt onto students from disadvantaged backgrounds, I just find it a bit rich, really. We've got to put it in the bigger context of provision for young people from working class backgrounds, include those who don't go to university, who get a tiny fraction of the funding that young people who go to university get. And government has done nothing over the last decade to address that gap in funding between the predominantly middle class young people who go to university and those.
For instance, if you go to a National Trust house, you can't just have a slice of cake these days. You can't just enjoy the garden. You have to be told off about what you think about slavery and about gay rights and all sorts of liberal causes. And it's just becoming a bit wearisome. I think people have had enough of being told off the whole time.
Right. Well, in terms of being told off, Sonia, if we return to the original thought on COVID-19 just to start with, do you agree with Quentin?
Well, I'm not sure which National Trust properties Quentin's been visiting that he's been getting all these lectures, because I haven't had them when I visited. I disagree in the main, in the sense that I think these are special, extenuating circumstances around COVID. I think we're all grown up enough to live with the restrictions that we've seen imposed on us by government in order to curb the spread of this virus, in order to save lives. I don't think they're going to be sticking around after it's safe and the risks are much lower. No government wants to impose this level of restrictions. Where I do agree with Quentin, though, is I do think there are some areas where actually we haven't scrutinised some of the laws and the regulations and the powers enough. And I think particularly that is true around policing and policing of protests. So a really important democratic right is the freedom to associate, the freedom to protest. A court ruled last week we still have that right under human rights law. And I do think that the government's policing bill, actually, I think Quentin is right that in this area, the government's policing bill seeks to give more powers to the police to curb protests, which I think is really dangerous, takes us onto dangerous territory. It's something we've seen this last year with COVID regulations, and we saw the effects of that on Saturday with the completely overbearing, overhanded policing of the Sarah Everard vigil by the Met Police.
All right, and we may return to the issue of that policing bill. We've discussed it an awful lot this week, but in the context, as you say, Sonia, in terms of curbs or freedom being curbed.
Well,
I just want to read you, David. We have pictures. We can't show them to you just at the moment, but they're of Sefton Park in Liverpool, where you can see crowds of people gathering, Sonia. Do you think people have got to the stage where they're beginning to think lockdown is already over?
I think there's a sort of, I think there's a positive feeling in the country, which is totally understandable. The vaccine rollout is going well. Lots of people are now in a position where, their older mums and dads or grandparents may have been vaccinated. So I think it's because I do really buy what the government says, how important it is that we stick by the rules. It would be a really difficult situation if we have lots of mixing between vaccinated and unvaccinated people, because that's when you might see vaccine resistant strains potentially developing here in the UK. So I think there's it's good that there's extra emphasis in the government messaging. It's going well, the vaccine rollout, but you still need to stick to the rules. That said, I think a much bigger issue than people not sticking to the rules is actually the lack of sick pay, for example, the lack of financial means for people who need to self-isolate, self-isolate, that the government hasn't tackled.
All right, that's all we've got time for. Thank you to all of our guests. And, of course, I will be back at 12:15 on Monday. And as we said earlier, the Prime Minister has a press conference later on. Bye-bye.